Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai ki te kaupapa whakahirihira o tēnei hui, nō reira, haere mai koutou, haere mai katoa. Can I extend a very special welcome to those of you who we can't see, but we know you're there, who have joined this webinar, and welcome to the discussion. We hope you will find it interesting, and we hope that you will be able to participate through questions later on. You will notice that you're able to ask questions through the Ask Questions facility at the bottom of the page. So just ask those questions anytime you want to, and we'll try to take them up towards the end. I'm Ragen Prasad. I'm a friend of the Baha'i community. For the last 40 years or so, I've foxed them. Whenever I asked, am I a Baha'i, I say to them, I thought everybody was, which often stops the discussion. But I have been friends of the Baha'i for a very long time. And in my race relations office, they were great friends of the office and of the kaupapa of race relations that we were promoting when I was there. Let me introduce briefly to you our three panelists. First, Behrouz Boochani, a refugee, a Kurdish-Iranian journalist, human rights defender, writer, and film producer, who in his own words is dedicated to empowering marginalized people. In New Zealand, we recall him well as the refugee who was imprisoned on Manus Island for 6 years, and from where he secretly, I understand, wrote of his imprisonment in his book, No Friend But the Mountains, using only his cell phone and text messages via messenger to get his material out. Behrouz, welcome, and thank you for making the time to be with us. I want to introduce Professor Kris Gledhill. Kris is a professor of law at Auckland University of Technology. He is an avid writer on contemporary issues, from whether the UK could be sued for endangering the world with their COVID strategy, to how New Zealand could have done better to prevent the attack on shoppers in Lynmore recently. He confesses that success for him is about creating change, however incremental, and leaving things better than when he started his career. He says he is still in that idealistic class who do law because they want to make things better. I can identify Kris with that sense of idealism. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making the time. Dr. Ket Endamian. Ket is an Iranian-born person of Turkish-Kurdish heritage, who in a YouTube post on spirituality and social cohesion tells of her parents' precarious journey to Pakistan to escape Iranian persecution, and goes on to describe her encounters from settling in Dunedin to researching the experience of displaced people. Her journey as a researcher, academic, and strategic advisor is an impressive one, and is as impressive as her uncomplicated description of the essentials of Baha'i teachings. Welcome, Kat. So we have an impressive panel today to interrogate the question of hate speech. My task is to be moderator. My task is simply to ensure everything flows, everybody gets to have their say, and for the discussion that will ensue. We promise you we'll finish at 7 p.m. as promised. This webinar is hosted by The Spirit of Work, which is a network of like-minded people dedicated to the application of moral, ethical, and spiritual principles at work. These principles are informed by Baha'i writings, which serve as foundations for transforming work by contributing to individual development, organizational growth, and community flourishing. The other important context for today's discussion is the focus on hate speech. This agenda is emerged from the report of the Royal Commission on the Christchurch mosque shootings about 2.5 years ago. The government has signaled its desire to alter hate speech laws in the interests of community cohesion, and has released a document for community consultation, which is a prelude to the final form amendments to the human rights and other acts might take over the next few months. There are many examples of persecution from around the world based on one's ethnicity, race, culture, religion, sexual orientation, family status, which also provide a context for the discussion of hate speech and discrimination. In a sense, they all form the context of today's discussion, no less than the persecution that you'll hear about of the Baha'i community in Iran and many others currently taking place you'll know about. New Zealand's human rights approach has historically been based on a balancing of the rights of citizens that citizens have under the Bill of Rights Act, especially freedom of expression, and the freedoms from discrimination contained in the Human Rights Act. It is doubtful if we have found the right balance between these two sets of rights, and debates have largely been about this balance. In the event, there have hardly been any successful prosecutions about inciting racial disharmony, despite there being no shortage of examples of race discrimination over the years. The report of the Royal Commission, I think, has added a new impetus to this discourse, which points to a possible direction of travel for the future. This focus on social cohesion begins to help us ask questions like, how can we expect to be included? How can we expect to have social cohesion when there are limits? There are few limits to what others can say about you and about your interests. So that introduction of the notion of social cohesion for Aotearoa New Zealand is an important one, and the government intends also to address sexual orientation as well. So that is the context of today's discussion. I now want to welcome Behrouz and ask him to make his presentation. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here to participate in this event. Actually, I think I should start with this, that for understanding this issue, how the system, how the government and how people are treating Baha'is, people in Iran, I think we should understand the context. Because when we talk about the minorities, of course, the minorities everywhere, doesn't matter where, in Iran, in Australia, in New Zealand, everywhere the minorities are actually facing the discrimination, facing persecution, and so actually they are facing the same and struggling with the same mentality everywhere, which is related to the power structure. So that is the general thing that we know about minorities and marginalized people. But I think we should look at the context in Iran that I want to say that we have actually two kind of minorities. A kind of minority is that the power structure, the government, is trying to actually discriminate them, and they are living under discrimination system, persecution, and they are marginalized. And the system actually is willing to assimilate them. And they go through this process, the process of assimilation, which we can understand it for ethnic minorities, like Kurdish people, Arab people in Iran, Turkish people in Iran. These ethnic minorities, the system actually has been trying to assimilate them and discriminate them. But we have a another kind of minorities, which I think that we should put Baha'is in that category, that the system is willing to eliminate them, to destroy them, and it's not only to, it's not designed to just take their identity. The system is willing to eliminate them. So that is, I think, important, that we really cannot understand this issue, and we cannot analyze it just through these concepts like marginalization, discrimination, and that. We need another word, because the system is willing to do that, and they have shown that what they want is just to destroy this community, just to eliminate them. And that's why I think it's very important that we just few minorities actually are facing this kind of mentality, and they are struggling with this. I think that is very important, because with, if we compare it with Kurdish people, the Kurdish people, because of population, because of geography, because of many reasons, they are not planning to do that, and they cannot do that, or they think that they are not able to do that. But with Baha'is, I think we should understand it through that. We should analyze it with that. Another thing, if we look at the minorities in everywhere or in Iran, again, we have two kind of minorities. Minorities that actually the system, I mean the government or the power structure is discriminating them or putting pressure on them. But the public and people and society, actually, they are supporting them, or they, or they have sympathy with them, or they, they don't support the government ideology, But in Iran, with my Baha'is, again, we have the worst kind of actually system, which is the government, and in the same time, society, and that happened in the history, over the past 2 centuries. We have seen, that sometimes, especially after the revolution, Islamic revolution, we see that Baha'is actually, they are under pressure from 2 sides, from the government and from people. So I think that's why I think we should understand this. We should look at the context to understand the Baha'is and how they, and we know the history. We know the history, and this history actually is not only the government or society. Actually, the intelligent people, writers, people who have been creating a knowledge, they created a knowledge to actually eliminate Baha'is. And I think that is very important, that, in everywhere, in every part of the system and society, we see that people. So how they do this, actually, I think the beginning of this, they start this with process of dehumanization. Dehumanization is very important and key concept here that we should understand it. This dehumanization actually happened through mostly through hate speech, and hate comments against any kind of minority, especially Baha'is, that we know that they call Baha'is Najis, which is a really, you know, it's very clearly that how they try to dehumanize the Baha'is people under this concept. So that's why I think, you know, I should mention again that we really cannot compare Baha'is with other minorities, you know, and we understand this just through marginalization, discrimination, and this kind of force. I think it's not enough because the system is willing to eliminate Baha'is people. So that's why I think it's very important that we understand the context. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Behrouz. Quite a useful and powerful appreciation of the difference that you talk about. It reminds me of many other cases where there's mass discrimination of a group in different societies could easily be put into those categories you talked about. So thank you for that. Kat will play the video just before your session. Can I now invite, before I invite Kris to present, can I just remind you that if you have questions, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, do come to us through that, and we'd appreciate that. I invite Professor Kris to make his presentation. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Can I just pick up one word that Behrouz used, and it's the word dehumanization. And I want to put that in the context of the human rights framework, because there's a lot of, I suppose, excitement whenever you discuss hate speech. And there's a lot of excitement from people who suggest that freedom of speech is an absolute. And I just want to try and discuss that as a concept in human rights law. It's certainly an important right, but it's not an absolute right. And the thing is that what we know from history, and with Behrouz's mention of dehumanization, as Ragen mentioned, lots of other situations have occurred where there have been atrocious breaches of people's human rights because they have been undermined as people. The Untermensch, for example, that was the language prior to the Holocaust. And the thing is that speech has a power, and that includes a power to set forth ideas which cause incredible amounts of harm. And so when I speak as a human rights lawyer, I like to provide people with a reminder of where the human rights framework comes from. And the starting point for the human rights framework in the modern era is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. But you've got to understand why that document was put into place. And it was essentially a document that was designed to draw a line under an age which could be called a eugenics age. Eugenics is the idea that there are some people who are better than others by virtue of their birth and have a status, which means they should be given rights. And it puts them in contrast to everybody else, the people who don't have rights. In the colonial era, that was the justification for the European powers coming out and civilizing the rest of the world. In class-based systems, it's the reason why some people are discouraged from having more children, breeding and swamping societies with unfit, unworthy people. It was an idea that was given its name via a British scientist, but then developed significantly in the United States of America before it was finally adopted with such horrific consequences by the Third Reich. And its consequences were clearly horrendous and have been horrendous for centuries. And that is why when the world decided after the end of the Second World War that it wanted to get rid of the social structures and ideas that had allowed the abominations of slavery, colonialism, and the Holocaust, the need was to replace that with a new framework. And that's where the human rights framework comes from. And that's why I'm proud to say, yes, I'm a human rights lawyer, because the alternative was so bloody awful. And that's why the human rights framework should be our starting point. Now, if we look at the human rights framework, and we've given effect to this in via an important UN document, the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which in New Zealand informs our Bill of Rights Act of 1990. The starting point to that is the equality rights, the non-discrimination rights. In fact, if we go back to the starting document that I mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's not an accident that it opens with those incredibly important words: all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this non-discrimination and equality motif is the reason why when you look to the expression of the right to freedom of speech, which is in Article 19 of the ICCPR, you'll see very important language in it. Yes, it sets out that everybody has the right to freedom of expression and the right to impart their views, but it's then followed by this language. The exercise of that right to freedom of speech carries with it special duties and responsibilities. So it isn't an absolute right, it's a limited right. And it's limited in particular by another important provision that sometimes gets overlooked when people talk about the right to freedom of speech. Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says this: any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited. Now, the advocates of freedom of speech always accept, yes, you cannot put forward incitement to hostility. Yes, you can limit freedom of speech that incites violence. But actually, the international human rights standard is you shall not incite discrimination either. And that's important to recognize, because we still have a world which discriminates on so many grounds. And look, there are important standards that have been developed by various bodies. And one of the ones I want to particularly mention is a body of the Council of Europe called the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. And it has an important policy recommendation from 2016 on combating hate speech. And it emphasizes the importance of making sure that freedom of expression does not extend so far to the advocacy, promotion, or incitement which leads to the denigration, hatred, vilification, stereotyping, stigmatization of a person based on who they are. It emphasizes the importance of not allowing that dehumanization, which actually is the source of so much harm that potentially happens. You see, the important thing about the human rights framework is that it includes the duty of the state to protect people from harm, including through assault, but including through all forms of other denigration, of which discrimination is often the source. There are some absolute human rights. One of them is not to be subject to torture or inhuman and degrading treatment. Well, if the effect of hate speech, including speech which incites discrimination, is that people are subject to treatment which is degrading, the stronger obligation is to end that and to recognize that freedom of speech, important though it is, has its limitations because it comes with those obligations. So the European Commission that I referenced against racial discrimination, the reason why it came up with that argument that hate speech laws must prohibit that incitement to discrimination and all forms of vilification is because they say in the preamble to that recommendation, the recognition that they have noted from what's been happening in Europe, that hate speech can reflect and promote the unjustified assumption that the user is in some way superior to the person who is being denigrated. In other words, that provides a timely reminder to the importance of ensuring that we do not have any ideas based on false eugenics ideas, that some people are good people with rights and there is all the rest. The importance is we're one human race, we are equal in dignity and rights, and hate speech has to be recognized as something which undermines the equal dignity of people. And that's why actually it needs to be regulated and regulated properly in all the contexts in which it occurs. Thank you for allowing me the time to share my views as to why hate speech and its regulation is an important topic that we should take seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris, for that well, illuminating discussion on the topic. Not that I haven't read much of that, but to put it in that form that you have is very powerful. And it is the best explanation I've heard about the limits to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. You know, we would say, look, of course you've got freedom of speech, but you can't try fire on the 21st floor of a crowded room because you feel like it. You know, there are limits. And it's quite interesting also that there are many learned people, some from your profession and some from mine, who actually talk in absolute terms about the freedom of expression and don't balance it with the extent to which it is fettered. Of course, others do argue that quite well. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to have a look at a brief video, and then immediately following that, you'll start, Kat, with your presentation. Okay.
دست انگلیس و روساست از بابی ها و بهایی شرکت کنند میکنند اما بیشتر روسا در جامعه انگلیسی ها روسیه به مخالف ماست. این از سوی خدا باشه و از طرف خداوند تبارک و تعالی نازل شده باشد، مثل احکامی باشد که در مورد نیازهای جامعه آیا این عبارات صحیح میتواند به جای آیات کریمه قرار بگیرد.
Thank you very much. I wanted to first thank everyone who's obviously joined the webinar, but particularly Kris, Ragen, and Behrouz for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here and to show up in solidarity. You know, it's something that I'm personally very grateful for. I wish I could have met you all in person, but the circumstances didn't allow for it. So as you know, you all mentioned, there's something very unique about state-sanctioned hate speech and the purpose in which it is created. And if you allow me, I'll share a few examples of how the hate speech against the Baha'is in Iran is not only untrue and baseless, it's quite hurtful and quite ugly. It won't be pleasant to hear some of this, but it's important to share, I think, a few examples of what we mean by hate speech propaganda against the Baha'is of Iran. So as that video mentioned, there are thousands of websites, books, social media accounts that are increasingly using words and images that depict Baha'is in very particular ways. So this dehumanization concept that Behrouz introduced at the beginning is very important to keep in mind. When Baha'is are depicted as demons, as zombies, as monsters, you know, there's an example of an image of a Baha'i being shown as wearing like a shroud of death and calling others to death. There are images of sacred Baha'i places where those places are depicted as tomb sites, tombstones, burning with monsters emerging from behind them. We know of children's books used in schools where Baha'i characters are depicted as being deceitful and fraudulent, dishonest, calling others to corruption. We have multiple recorded messages from clergy in Iran who go on public television and make statements such as, you know, Baha'is are dirty, they're dishonest. In one case, one clergyman was asked, why is it that Baha'is cannot be buried in public cemeteries? And he responded, if you throw the body of a Baha'i into the sea, it is dirty. And if you take it out of the water, out of the sea, it is still dirty. And so, you know, in another instance, a clergyman was asked about what to do if you meet a Baha'i. And he says, you know, if anyone walks around and says, I am a Baha'i, he must be killed. You know, these are very upsetting things to hear. And of course, by anyone who's met a Baha'i, who has come into contact with the Baha'i faith and its teachings, knows that none of this is true and none of it is founded on truth. But what distinguishes that from being something horrible to hear and not being just words and pictures is when it is translated to being used as justifications for acts of hate. I have the bounty of living in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, where a number of Iranian Baha'i New Zealanders whose family members have been imprisoned or executed for their faith live nearby. My own family, my friends and their family members have experienced very similar situations of torture, imprisonment, confiscation of property, denial of education. And what many people in Iran do not know is exactly who these people are, what happened to them, and how it could have happened to them. You know, what do you think would happen in Iran if everyone knew the stories and life of people like Jinus Mahmoudi, who was the founder of marine meteorology? She was the first woman to head the Iranian Meteorological Organization, which meant she held the equivalent station of like a general. And she was imprisoned and executed alongside 8 other members of a Baha'i committee she was serving on in Iran. What if they knew about her husband, Hushain Mahmoudi, who was a film director and the first presenter of children's programs on Iranian television? He disappeared and was executed a year prior to his wife. I know their daughter, Ariana Khadim, who lives a few streets down from me. I know that none of the claims against them, such as that they are jasus, spies, or being najis, dirty, are utterly baseless. What if we come to know of people like Abdulali Asadiari, who was a high school teacher and a dedicated member of his community, who was executed also alongside 8 other members of a committee that he was a part of. I know 3 of his daughters, one of whom has just joined us by video, Jamalia. They also live a few streets away from me. I know what they endured and the indignity that was thrusted on them when they lost their father. Now, Mrs. Rouhani, who also lives a few streets away from me, and for 20 years had worked for the postal and telegraph industry in Iran and was an avid teacher of children's classes. She too was sentenced to death and later had her sentence reduced to life imprisonment. And for reasons that we still do not know today, she was released after serving only 3 years of her sentence. But we have the good fortune of having her with us. You see, the government of Iran does not want the people of Iran to know these are all good people. If they knew, the government would lose legitimacy. They do not want the people of Iran to know that the Baha'i faith teaches unity and peace, and that Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, that his message for humanity is to bring about the oneness of humanity. If they knew that, the influence of the Baha'i faith would spread. If the people of Iran only know what the government tells them, then when they arrest Baha'is, they imprison Baha'is, they confiscate Baha'i properties, they burn down Baha'i businesses, they deny Baha'i students access to university and desecrate their cemeteries, people may think, well, maybe the Baha'is did do something wrong. Maybe this is justified. Maybe they are guilty of something. Maybe it's best I do not say anything in their defense. Maybe it's better that I look the other way. So we see how this works, as Behrouz mentioned at the beginning, that there is something particularly unique about how state-sanctioned hate propaganda operates at the level of the state and at the level of people. If you tell enough lies about a group of people, if you plant enough seeds of doubt and prejudice through misinformation and hatred, then people start changing how they think of them. Mrs. Rouhani's own interrogator was her neighbor. The guard who was responsible for taking Abdulali Asadiari to his execution was one of his students. You see, in the climate of fear and hate, anything is possible. But our response to such injustice should be greater acts of truth-telling, just as we are doing tonight. This isn't just about the past, though I have mentioned some examples from the past, but we are also talking about very real present challenges for Iranian Baha'is today. There is more disinformation growing against Baha'is every day. Every day the hate is growing and the persecution is becoming more severe. You know, since the 79 revolution, over 200 Iranian Baha'is were executed, but thousands have been arrested, detained, and interrogated. One example of this was in May of last year. 7 Baha'is from a city called Shiraz were sentenced to imprisonment on trumped-up charges, including the crime of teaching children as an arts instructor. Tens of thousands of Baha'is have been deprived of jobs, pensions, educational opportunities. As Behrouz mentioned, this is a system designed to eradicate an entire community, not only eradicate them physically with their life, but through the strangulation of their economic and educational growth, their social and cultural development. Since President Rouhani came to power up until this year, when with the recent election, there have been at least 1,080 documented incidents of economic persecution, with 31 incidents in 2020 alone. The Baha'i community's holy places, their cemeteries, have been confiscated, vandalized, destroyed. Not even the dead are led to be at peace. And specifically in relation to hate speech propaganda, we've seen that in the course of 1 year, in 2020 alone, there were more than 9,511 articles, videos, web pages appearing in government-controlled media, not individual, it's not a troll on Twitter or on Facebook writing a hateful comment. This is a government-sanctioned media campaign. And it was always disseminated through state-sponsored channels. So this is a warning for us. It's not just of the past, it's not just of the present, but a warning of potentially what could come in the future. So dear Ariana, Jamalia, Mrs. Rohani, who have offered their stories tonight as an example of what is really the worst that can happen from hate speech propaganda. In order for us to respond to this, we can take some very simple actions. One is, of course, what we're doing tonight, which is learning and educating ourselves, arming ourselves with truth, with the right information, hearing these stories. Practically, as you would have seen at the end of that video, there's a campaign in place called Stop Hate Propaganda. And here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we have an open letter, which will be shared, I think, in the chat function, where you can, yes, Lida Rohani has put the link for the open letter in the chat. It's a simple form. You put your name, and it seems like a simple act of solidarity, but it's one way of saying that what is happening is not right. So I want to thank again the three individuals who've turned their videos on and have offered to show their faces. They've also offered to share more of their stories. If people are interested, you can contact me privately at another time and we can perhaps set something up. But I just wanted to share those few words and thank you very much again for tonight.
Well, thank you for a powerful I don't know what the right word is. It's not a story. It's I get the impression you're sharing part of your life, and those of people who are dear to you. And for every one that you recall, how many more of them are there? So there is nothing pretty about discrimination of this type. I mean, this is the worst aspects of it. I think this is a odd thing I'm going to say, but that's what's in my mind. I mean, at least there is a blessing here that there are people like you, Baha'is, who are able to speak and able to bring the stories alive. And there are many others who are experiencing similar things who don't have those voices. And it's left to people like us, people that are listening, and people who are in positions of power to do something about this. So thank you very much for that. It's an inadequate response to what you've just presented, but thank you. Well, those who are listening, here we have it. 3 very powerful presentations, 3 very important pieces of the jigsaw. I mean, I'm privileged to hear it myself, and we started with we were compelled to try to understand the difference between discounting a group and eliminating them. I mean, there is a difference, and one seems very permanent and very brutal. Then, as we proceed from there, we hear the genesis of the idea of human rights. It didn't just come up in 1948. it came true as a result of the violence that was perpetrated on millions of people. But there was a glimmer there to say, you know, the world does not want this to happen again. So we created the United Nations system, and all of the work that's continues to come out of it as the kind of lead organization to shine a light on these issues and keep on presenting it to us. And then rounded off by you, Kris, to say at Senior Moments at CAT, to say it's real. Well, let's just throw that around amongst the panelists. What's in your mind? Just go where you want to go, or respond to other presentations if you like. Behrouz?
Yeah. I think I wanted to mention two things. First is that I think the situation is getting changed among the people, I mean, among the society. I mean, we see something, you know, that the people, because of social media, actually, people are getting to know Baha'is community. And I think the main reason is because the people have lost their trust in the government, what the government has said for many decades. So people are actually questioning, you know, especially the new generation are questioning what the government has been saying about minorities, or, you know, about Baha'is. Still, I think there is a huge, you know, pressure from the society. But I think people of Iran are getting to know. And what Kat says, I think it was important. I should mention, I say that on based of my experience, you know, as a person who comes from a marginalized community. I think what is important is we should challenge the narrative of the power structure, you know, a narrative which created by actually writers, artists, and the government. You know, no, I'm not just talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran now. I mean, generally, you know, an image which created about Baha'is community. You know, I think what is important is challenging this narrative. For challenging this narrative, I think is to sharing our narrative. You know, so I think sharing, writing is very important. You know, this kind of, for example, these events is very important. People come here and see and learn. You know, I am learning. You know, I was attending an event just as an audience just last week in Clubhouse. So people were there and they were talking, they were discussing their history. I mean, the Baha'is people, they were talking, they were sharing stories, you know. Among them, there was an actor that she said that when, you know, how they actually kick her out of the project, you know, and later she had to leave the country. So, I mean, that is very important to share these stories. So I have another thing, I will share it later. So that was the first point. Yeah, if I have time later.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a very a hint of optimism, Behrouz, in what you say. And we have an incorrigible optimist in me, and there's another one in Kris. So it's good to hear that. we have some questions. There's a question there from Seema, and Kris, if I can direct it to you. How can we bring, Seema says, how can we bring these injustices to United Nations attention? I think some of this has happened already, but can you add to that?
Yeah, look, I'm a lawyer, so I tend to use legal processes and have a bit of faith in them, because sometimes if you battle away at a legal process, it does get you the right result. There are numerous ways. There are, even when a country has a limited participation because it hasn't signed up to that many human rights treaties, there are ways through the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The processes include raising complaints to the Human Rights Council that there is a systemic problem that needs investigation by the Human Rights Council. There are experts called special rapporteurs who investigate situations of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment in a country. So there are methods whereby complaints can be raised from countries like New Zealand. And if we have these mechanisms that we've set up, that we put some hope into, like the United Nations, we're obliged to make use of them. Because if we don't use them, they will fade away and they won't have the impact that they could have. But like I say, I'm a lawyer, so I like to litigate these matters, including by the methods through the United Nations. There are other important things to do as well, and that's where education, we're talking to people, whereby exercising your own right to freedom of expression, bearing in mind that you have responsibilities to protect other people, where they become important as well. So let's not limit it just to legal action. Let's make sure that we have a holistic, multi-pronged attack on the evils of hate speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Kris. I see there's a contribution from my friends from Ratanapa. And it's another one from Natasha Maria. And if, Kat, if you could take them both, can you see it? Can you see them?
Yeah, I see them. Sure. I mean, I'll go through them very briefly.
If I can just share the question with the listening. But Kat, it could be helpful to elaborate on the status of Iranian Baha'i as unprotected infidels. And Natasha Maria's his question is for you, Kat. Thanks so much for sharing the personal stories and experiences of your community. Are there any gender dimensions to the discrimination that Baha'i people face? Perhaps where oppression of Baha'i in Iran is especially acute. Over to you.
Sure. So in terms of the unprotected infidels, it's an important question because it brings to light the religious ideological component of the persecution of the Baha'is, which has a particularly unique aspect to it, which is that in the Iranian constitution, there are religious minorities that are protected by the constitution, and they are people that are considered to be of the book. So they're the recognized religious minorities, the Jewish community, the Christian community, and the Zoroastrian community. That does not mean that those communities are not persecuted. There are many instances of persecution of their religious freedom in Iran. Nevertheless, they are recognized by the constitution, but the Baha'i faith is not recognized primarily because Baha'u'llah, who's the Prophet founder, came after the Prophet Muhammad, and that in itself is considered that anybody who converts from Islam to being a Baha'i is considered a heretic, and therefore that infidel sort of label is applied to them, and therefore they're not protected by those laws. In terms of there's the question about Baha'i women and gender discrimination or persecution. There are others who will know better than me, but my understanding is that actually it's been indiscriminate when it comes to gender, you know, both men and women. And in some cases, I could argue that there are women who have been targeted more directly, perhaps with assumptions that they may be weaker, clearly not the case, but or maybe it projects a particular type of fear. But no, both men and women have been arrested, imprisoned, their homes have been searched. You know, there are many, there's the case of the women who were executed in one group, the youngest being a 17-year-old, Mona. So, you know, there are many examples where this hasn't necessarily been, you know, only the men are being discriminated.
Thank you. There is a question there from Lachlan. How can we increase the momentum within New Zealand in terms of convincing the government to make this a priority to raise on the international stage? Kris and or Kat, has there been any government position taken on this? Kris?
I'm not familiar with that. I haven't researched that position, but I agree there should be a position taken if there hasn't been.
Yeah, New Zealand has made has been, you know, what's called part of the group of states that are in support of obviously human rights in Iran as a general, and so they vote for that at the United Nations Human Rights Council. But in terms of what we can do to increase, you know, awareness and pressure, you know, these things like that open letter. I hope everyone adds their name if they're moved to do so, because there is a power in numbers. And there are certain, when there's a certain degree of momentum, then things can be elevated or escalated to the attention of MPs. But there are many MPs in New Zealand who have been very supportive of the Baha'is. Yeah.
Yep. I can vouch to that from my time in the House. There is a anonymous a question from anonymous attendee. But it's a maybe a sensitive question, so don't feel obliged to take it up if you can't. You may want to do it in writing. But he thanks you all for your contribution. Just wondering, the non-Baha'i Iranian community of New Zealand, they expressed a view, or is this a difficult question? Well, the silence might tell you something. We don't have an answer to that. Can I just, somebody want to take that up?
No, I'm not sure if Behrouz had heard, and also I think he wanted to share something beforehand.
Yeah, just I wanted to talk about actually minorities again in general in Iran. So we have ethnic minorities that actually they are struggling with mostly with the discrimination, with persecution, violence, and also the process of assimilation. So this assimilation process actually they design it to take the ethnic identity. And I think that is very important, but I think I wanted to mention this, that sometimes these minorities, that they are under pressure, they actually, discriminate other minorities. So I think that is very important, that we can't say that the Baha'is, you know, Baha'is are discriminated by both the society and the government, and also by these minorities as well. So, but definitely is less than other part of the society. But that is very important that we recognize that. You know, when we recognize that, it's very easier to actually educate those minorities because they already are familiar with this system. They understand how discrimination and persecution, you know, they are targets, you know. So that's why I think it's very important that we create this connection between Baha'is community with those ethnic minorities resistance. You know, it's very easier to convince a court. It's much easier to actually educate an Arab, Turkish, or other ethnic minorities to understand, you know, what the Baha'is actually are enduring, you know, how they are suffering. So that is very important point. And I myself, with my friends and people that I know, that, you know, my network, we have been trying, you know, in social media, just to, and especially in Clubhouse, which is a new platform, social media platform, just to actually bring all of these minorities together, you know, to educate others, to actually share their stories and understand each other's. So that is not only about Baha'is, you know, sometimes I say this about, you know, LGBTQ people, you know. So if we look at the Kurdistan society, for example, so Kurdistan society, Kurdish people, actually they are suffering, but in the same time, they are actually discriminating the minorities among them, like Baha'is, like women, you know, like LGBTQ people. So I mean that is very important that we create this connection between these minorities to support each other, to be united, and, you know, try to actually share their stories to challenge that narrative. So I think that is very important that we have this connection and we make it stronger. Yeah.
And so if I may, Ragen, just wanted to say, you know, Behrouz, your being here tonight is an example of that, you know, and to show that in action and not just in words is very, it's an example. And I support you in that response, that really this is something that, of course, not only Baha'is in Iran are suffering from propaganda, from direct persecution, discrimination, oppression, and there's definitely a commonality and something that we need to band together for. So thank you for that contribution.
Thank you, Behrouz and Kat. I mean, it is one of the enigmas of this field that you sometimes find discrimination amongst discriminated groups. And when you see it, you know, if you're able to step back, and if you're not of either group, when you see it, you kind of, there's a sadness about it, because you're experiencing yourself, and yet the way we've been socialized or something, you know, throws us to those corners where we take our own position and we have become part of the clobbering machine. On that note, there's a question from Murray that you might want to take up. What is the role of non-state media in Iran in raising awareness of state-sponsored hate speech against Baha'is or their experiences?
Should I answer?
Yes, please. Yes.
I actually, I know the media in Iran, so I'm following them. I think so. The media, we have again two kind of media. So the media inside the country, they are a part of the system. At least for the Baha'is and covering their stories, I think they are a part of the system and they fully support the system, or they are silent about this discrimination and persecution, you know, because you know, we are talking about a dictatorship system. So among the media inside the Iran, absolutely, they are absolutely silent, or they are supporting the system. So that is among, but we have some media who are, you know, overseas. And, you know, the mainstream media, most of them are in London, like Manoto TV, like Iran International TV, and BBC the Persian, and also in America we have Radio Farda, and Voice of America TV, and also in Netherlands we have Radio Zamane, and another web that we have is Iran Wire. So among these media, actually the situation is better, and they are actually they are covering the news about the Baha'is. But I think the problem with those media is that I think they should be more active and have more program, and also they should have more program to educate people, you know, educate people in Iran. And I think that is very important. But I think they are supportive, but the problem is that they are not really active as much as we expect. You know, they should do more. They should do more, because it's very important, you know, as I before mentioned at beginning, you know, really there is a difference between Baha'is minorities in Iran with others. You know, the system is willing to eliminate them, you know. And for example, if we compare it with Kurdish people, you know, I myself, I went to university very easily. I didn't have problem. I am, you know, I did master in Iran, you know. So I mean, that is very different, really. So I think that is very, very important that this media overseas, they do more. At least they create a space for Baha'is to share their narrative, because really, I say that on base of my experience, you know, in Manus Island especially, that sharing stories, because refugees are marginalized people as well, you know. So sharing stories is so important, you know, to challenge that narrative. So that's why I think, but I think the best website, I think, is Iran Wire. Is very, I think they are doing well, Iran Wire, which is a quite a popular website. Yeah, I think they are doing something, but they should do more, definitely.
We have just under 20 minutes left, and I wanted just for a few minutes to turn your attention to the debate that's going on in New Zealand, the contemporary debate around what I referred to earlier, what the Royal Commission has said, what the proposal is, and what are some of the debates going on around a hate speech provision. Have you got any thoughts on that? If I start from Kris and go to Kat and then Behrouz.
So my view is that we need to accept the wisdom of the international community, and the international community's wisdom is expressed in Articles 19 and 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it's worth remembering that New Zealand signed up to that document in 1978. And the person who signed us up, or the Prime Minister in charge at the time that we signed up to that document, was Robert Muldoon. That's something that we signed up to 43 years ago, and we still don't prohibit hate speech based on religion. So we are non-compliant with our obligations. And we saw that one of the effects of that was the possibility of allowing the radicalization of people who hate others on the basis of white supremacy and hatred of various religions, most particularly in the New Zealand context, our Muslim brothers and sisters. The Royal Commission was very clear. We need to do something about that, and we need to be compliant with the wisdom of the international community that you have to have hate speech laws, and they must include inciting discrimination, because discrimination is the starting point for so many harms in society. Yes, we need to have a mature debate about it, but we are not a free speech absolutist country. We already restrict freedom of speech in all sorts of ways. All the hate speech legislation needs to do is make sure that we also restrict it in a way that undermines ideas which lead on to eugenics and the horrors that that leads on to.
Thank you. Behrouz, Kate, you add to that?
I think that is very important. So when we talk about the freedom of speech, you know, when you say, if I say it in simple words, when you say something against the majority, and you know what's mentioned, white supremacy, it's so different when you say something against minorities in the society, which they are already vulnerable. So I think that is very equal, you know. So that's why I think it's very important that any kind of law that we have and we going to have is that we should make sure that the vulnerable people, so it can be Muslim people or it can be refugees or anyone in the society, I think they should be protected. That is very important, you know. And if I share my experiences, that, for example, in Manus Island, so anything that happened in that island, you know, sometimes a refugee was killed, or always the government said something in the media against us. For example, they said, this person, he was killed because they were lying, you know, he was killed because he was a drug dealer, for example, you know, and we didn't have a platform to defend ourselves, you know, we were vulnerable in front of that propaganda against us. So, I mean, that is a simple example that I say, you know, the minorities don't have that platform actually in the media to defend themselves. So that's why they are vulnerable in front of hate speech, and hate speech is not freedom of speech. That, you know, that's what I believe, yeah.
Thanks, Behrouz. Kat?
Yeah, I think in the context of New Zealand after the March 15 attacks, there came a very clear understanding that of the power of misinformation. You know, how misinformation on the one hand, when used by states, can be a tool of oppression, but when wielded by individuals, can lead to forms of radicalization, whether it be white supremacy or otherwise. And there's a need to protect the people, and they're often, as Behrouz mentioned, they are often the minorities, the marginalized people who are the ones who will be the subject of those attacks. And those attacks are not a mere sort of a statement of dislike, but they're often to incite action. And that's, so there is that. I think in terms of the debate here, of course, there's a question of how far does it go? How loose is the definition? You know, to what extent does it impact freedom of speech? But at the level of principle, I think it's something that we saw the need for after that attack, and we can band together about.
Thank you for three of those points. I mean, I totally agree. I think Behrouz has dropped his phone. Okay, Kris, you're absolutely right that, you know, we don't have an option but to do what many countries are now doing, particularly the European Union, UK, and other places. You know, there now are good models that we can draw from, and we simply have got to bite the bullet and include these provisions in our act. And I think that New Zealand is in a I was going to say a charmed place, but there has been an enormous contribution by Maori to the future development of New Zealand, because since 1960, with the resurgence of the treaty, they've begun to programmatically and slowly, but assuredly, you know, change the discourse to a point now where, you know, we partnership does mean something, indigeneity does mean something, and the settlements do mean something. So there's a wonderful example from which us migrants, and I'm one of them, can draw from to gain purchase in the debate and in the shaping of these kinds of issues. So I think that there is no choice but to get it right. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean we're going to satisfy everybody. But in time and over time, our courts and jurisprudence and our Human Rights Commission and others will begin to take us to another place where the kinds of issues we've experienced in the last 2.5 years in New Zealand, but certainly in the last few years in the international community, and you've told us a lot about the Iranian example today with Baha'is. There are others as well. So yes, I'm hoping that it will. The space is there. There are one or two other questions, and I think we have touched on the views of the panel on some of those. If I can now come to give each one of you a final opportunity to make any comments you want to, and if you could also address your sense of optimism, or how much optimism do you have that over a period of time that those things that Kat, you advocate for, and Behrouz, you share, and Kris, will come to pass. So a concluding comment plus a question about whether are you optimistic. Kat, why don't you start first?
I am optimistic, while also being realistic of the present realities. And I say optimistic from the growing understanding globally. You know, technology can be positive depending on how you use it. It's just a tool. And we've seen how, you know, in Iran, the state is using technology to wield hate and use it for that purpose. But similarly, we see it as a platform where we can learn more and connect with each other more. I do agree that there's a growing swell of the Iranian populace, both within the country and globally, that is coming to understand more and more the truth, so to speak. the realism that I have is that we need to also do the work. You know, we have to speak, we have to share the stories, we have to stand in solidarity. We have to see these issues as being connected to one another. You know, the freedom, so-called, of one group of people has to be connected to the freedom of all people. You know, the human rights of one group is not fully enjoyed if all people are not enjoying the human rights. So we need to stand together in that way. And I think that we're seeing many, many examples of that happening, tonight being one of them. And again, as this is my final words, I just wanted to thank the three of you again for being here tonight and participating. And I hope to meet, I know Ragen we've met in person, but both Kris and Behrouz to meet in person at some point. Thank you.
Kris, would you like to go next?
It's 40 years, actually, this month that I started law school in the Northern Hemisphere. And when I'm trying to explain human rights concepts, I don't have difficulties explaining them to young people because they get it. I only have problems explaining it to people who are my age or older. So I'm actually very much still a glass half full person. I'm from Yorkshire. I have to be a glass half full person. It's inevitable. But I still am, because the people who are coming through into positions of power in our society, actually, they get it. They understand the human rights framework, and they understand the importance of not just saying the right thing, but doing the right thing. As Kat has just mentioned, there is still a lot of work to be done, because we've got these idealistic statements of principle in documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we need to give effect to them sooner rather than later. But yes, they're universal values, and they're universal values which are becoming increasingly accepted, in my view. But that is my glass half full, rose-tinted spectacles view of the world.
From Yorkshire, Mike, no less. Thank you. Last word to you, Behrouz, before I have a couple of sentences.
Thank you very much. I wanted to appreciate you for creating this space, this opportunity that we come together and talk. Thank you, Kris, Kat. Very nice to see you and meet you. So hopefully meet you in person as well. So just the last point I wanted to mention is that I think creating change is really difficult, and the true change actually is creating change, actually change the people imagination about Baha'is, you know, particularly about Baha'is, that people, because they have created an image, you know, about Baha'is. So I think that happened mostly with through art and literature, language, to challenge that image. So, but we should celebrate our little change. We should be aware of it. We should recognize it and understand it and celebrate it. Yeah, just to continue. I think that is important.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry for my phone. My phone fell twice.
It's okay. Can I thank each one of you for making time available and for sharing so fully your own wisdom and your own experiences. You're all three of you very special people with tremendous experiences. And I see you as part of the solution. So thank you for your contribution. You've you've added value to the discourse tonight. I've learned a few things as well, and you've stated those things without any acrimony or without any other agenda than one of being wanting to create change and sharing your experiences. So thank you for that. Can I thank everybody who has made a contribution through a question or a comment? The last two came from Ratna Pa, which is more by way of a statement, which we understand. So thank you very much for that. So I thank all those who are participating, thank each one of you, and keep safe, and another week of lockdown. Good night.
Thank you.